Gachiakuta's best appeal is actually its biggest flaw. It's slowly become the #1 anime on Crunchyroll because of how popular it is with casual anime fans. But this appeal also does it a disservice, because a lot of people don't get Gachiakuta at first, claiming that it's just another shonen or that it takes too long to build the story. But that's actually because of the fact that Kei Urana writes the story to seem one way, and you really only get what's going on once you read the story 2 or 3 times. That's why in this video, I'm gonna explain how Gachiakuta gaslights you, discuss why new fans are turned off by the story, but also explain why Gachiakuta has slowly become one of the most popular anime in years. Just be warned that there may be some spoilers. But like I said, one of the first reasons so many people are getting into Gachiakuta is because of its mainstream appeal. It's a shonen battle series with cool characters, which is only made to look cooler thanks to the designs of Kei Urana and the anime adaptation of Studio Bones. On top of that, Gachiakuta has a power system that immediately stands out from other series, and the story makes a point to flesh out the power system throughout each of the new chapters. Naturally, new fans expect the power system to be a big part of the story, which is exactly what happens when the first big arc is a fight against Jabber. But that's where Gachiakuta kind of gaslights people, because you go in seeing this big power system and seeing that the first big arc is this cool fight, and you think, okay, so this is gonna be like other shonen, which kind of gives you the wrong expectations, because fights really aren't that important in Gachiakuta. It's part of the reason why Gachiakuta actually breaks a lot of the usual shonen battle series tropes, while very much reading like a typical shonen manga. So for example, the first big arc is the Jabber fight. After that, we go to Canvas Town, where we find out about the enchantments. Here, there aren't any fights. The next arc is where we meet Amo, and there is a fight, but it's less about the action and more about learning how Amo became who she is. The fight is just the launching point into her backstory. Even after this arc, when Rudo and the cleaners get jumped by the raiders and their new boss Zodal, there's actually a surprising lack of fights. It's funny because I remember this arc almost like the Infinity Castle arc, where they invade the villain's territory and the characters all get their own fights, but it wasn't until I reread this arc that I realized how little fighting actually goes on. I won't spoil it for people who still haven't seen it yet, but I will say that there's only 2 real fights out of the 5 or so matchups that take place. And what's even more surprising is that we really don't learn that much about the main characters in this arc. We learn a bit about Rio, but only enough to leave us with more questions. The only character whose backstory we see is Zonka, but that's it, which totally goes against the tradition of big fights serving as the launching point for flashbacks, where we learn about a character's backstory right before they get some big power-up. But that just doesn't happen in this arc. In fact, this is another reason why a lot of new fans have trouble getting into Gachiakuta early on. Because you expect it to be like other shonen anime, so you get confused when, surprisingly, you don't get any backstories for Rudo or the other characters. Instead, the story focuses on the world building in the early chapters, and actually fleshes out the characters through their smaller interactions, rather than big emotional backstories. It's something that you don't pick up on until the later chapters, and then go back and reread the story. And that's what I mean when I say that Gachiakuta's mainstream appeal really does it a disservice, because the story gaslights you by setting things up so that you expect it to be like your typical shonen anime, but then immediately breaks a number of established conventions and leaves you wondering why the story plays out the way it does. But this isn't the only way Gachiakuta gaslights you, because just as it appears to be a typical shonen but clearly isn't, Gachiakuta also markets itself as a story about trash but is really about the exact opposite. The series is marketed in a way that focuses on how Rudo is thrown away into the abyss. It highlights the underground aesthetic in these strange worlds built in trash. And the whole premise is that Rudo and the cleaners fight trash beasts. In fact, the whole first chapter is built around this conflict between how we view trash versus valuables, and how that translates to the way we treat other people. So this theme of trash clearly takes a big big role in the story. But this is another example of gaslighting because the story isn't about trash. It's really about gifts. The world is literally trash, but none of the characters actually use trash as part of their abilities. The givers and raiders use items called vital instruments, and these are anything but trash. Trash is something that's used up before you throw it away, but vital instruments are objects that are both literally and figuratively gifts. They're literally special objects that each character holds onto as they place sentimental value onto them, and they also serve as gifts in the form of special abilities that characters get by nurturing their vital instruments. They're so invaluable that you lose your ability if you lose your instrument. In this way, Gachiakuta gaslights you again because it appears to be a story about trash, but the trash is just the very top layer of the premise. It's really about the way characters value items and treat them like valuables. At the same time, you can't avoid the trash monsters, the Mad Max looking world, and the literal mountains of trash, so there is this constant dynamic of the story being about trash, but also not really. And nobody represents this better than Rudo, because when we see his powers for the first time, it seems like he has the power to turn trash into magic items. But what we soon realize is that his ability has nothing to do with trash. Instead of destroying items and discarding them, Rudo actually completes items. He takes items with sentimental value, imbues them with new purpose, and uses them to their full potential rather than throwing them away because they seem broken or used up, hence why he dubs his ability Reduce, Reuse, Recycle. In this way, Rudo is living proof that the story really isn't about trash at all, because throwing away trash and recycling things are two totally different things. This means that what Gachiakuta is really about is gifts and how we can find new purpose. And on that note, this is also why Gachiakuta is the kind of story that needs to be read 2 or 3 times before you can fully appreciate it. Because while it may come off as a dark story, it's actually a lighthearted and optimistic story. The first chapter sets you up to think that Gachiakuta is going to be full of dark stories and edgelords, between the theme of people being viewed as trash and Rudo claiming he's going to kill everyone, and in the mysterious gruesome murder of his guardian, and the incredibly dark backstory of Amo. Gachiakuta often affirms that assumption of it being a dark story, but the story also kills that theory pretty early on. The first few chapters show Rudo as an awkward kid rather than an edgy brat. We see him get into a poop fight with Zonka. The fight against Jabber is intense, but it actually ends on a good note. The following arc with Gremlin is an uplifting story where they find their voice as an artist. Even in what is probably the story's darkest arc, where we find out about Amo's tragic past and how she was sold into slavery by her own mother, this trauma doesn't define her character, and it doesn't even define the tone of this arc. The story quickly shifts from this dark trauma to an ending where Amo finds her first true friend in Rudo, and Rudo admits to his impulsive behavior and makes a new commitment to helping the people around him. And even in the big arc against Zodal and the Raiders, where it seems like the villains have the upper hand and we see a mysterious new dark side of Rio, the arc ends on a good note and everyone ends up okay. And this is what I mean when I say that Gachiakuta gaslights you into thinking it's a dark story. It definitely comes off that way in the first chapter. Even the punk designs and underground art style support it by giving the story an edgier vibe than something like Dawn to Dawn or Demon Slayer. At the same time, that same art style is full of plenty of chibi faces and over-the-top absurd scenes that are constantly turning into memes. The characters themselves are just as goofy, and they contribute to an overall lighthearted tone among the main cast. And the story consistently plays out in an optimistic way, where characters like Rudo believe in their ability to make things better and genuinely want to grow throughout the story rather than being defined by trauma. On the one hand, all of this gaslighting can hold the story back. Gachiakuta might be popular now, but it definitely wasn't that way when the anime started. People hyped up the trailers in the first episode, but the anime worked out more like a slow burn for the first month or so. The fact that it's only just now getting the popularity it deserves only proves that it takes time to really get what the story is actually about. And even then, you kind of have to go back and reread the story from a new perspective before you can fully appreciate everything that's going on. You can even see this in reviews where people drop the series because it's too slow in the beginning or because they don't focus enough on the characters. Read any review from people who dropped the show early on, and they all say basically the same thing. They didn't like it because it was just another basic shonen and it was trash. But like I said before, that mainstream appeal is a blessing and a curse. In this case, it gives an otherwise deep and thoughtful story mainstream appeal, but that also means people can be quick to dismiss it. But the benefit to this is when you actually give the story a chance, you realize it's anything but typical and actually surprises you in a number of ways. It breaks a lot of shonen tropes while still carrying the appeal of any other shonen. It gives you cool characters that you can invest in without the cliche of lengthy backstories. It gives you this underground punk world, but also gives you a lighthearted story with goofy characters. At every point in the series, Gachiakuta is balancing how it appears on the surface and all of the incredible payoff that can only truly be appreciated when you take the time to realize why the story is more than it appears. Not unlike the way Rudo finds the value in items that look like nothing more than trash. And that is exactly how Gachiakuta gaslights you.